A few months ago I made a video that showed only the trimming process for these plates, but this week, now that they're all fired, we'll be going through the entire process. I'm throwing what might be one of the easiest shapes to make, using clay that's verging on being too soft to work with. But there is a reason for that, and it has something to do with the colour of the clay here. This is my usual high iron stoneware body, which is usually a much brighter, more pink tone. But with this particular batch of clay, which is Reclaim, I let it sit and fester for far too long. And for any of you potters watching, you might know what that means. This clay is full of mould, and if only you could smell just how putrid it is. The colour difference isn't that noticeable here, but during the next stage, which is trimming, it becomes very apparent which is the normal clay and which is the aged, mouldy stuff. Since the clay was in this condition, I didn't just want to get rid of it, so instead I threw a batch of the most straightforward pots I could think of, which are these relatively thick, for the time being, side plates, or a breakfast plate, you might call it. Something for toast or cake. Drier foods, I suppose, as these pots don't have any outer wall or flange to keep any liquids contained. Each one of these takes about 1.5 minutes to make, which meant I could rinse through this stinky clay really fast, and as it was so soft, it made centering and flattening the lump feel ridiculously easy. And this is something I would really recommend if you're making flatware, especially simple shapes with very little vertical height, is to try and use the softest clay you have available. As when you're making dinner plates and pots like this, 90% of the work is in centering the lump of clay and flattening it. So for me at least, I want to make that process as simple and streamlined as it can be. I then let these plates sit out for a couple of days, low to the ground so they dry slowly, and with plastic slung over them overnight. As with flatware like this, you need to be careful not to let one side of the plate dry out more than the other, as this can help cause them to warp and become uneven. And for flatware like this, where I rely on everything staying flat, drying them very carefully and in a controlled manner is vital to the process. Now the clay's colour at this point looks like normal, and these plates are now perfectly leather hard and ready to be turned. First I trim the top, which I'll be making perfectly smooth and hollowing out the form slightly so that it has a concave surface. It's fixed to the wheel with 3 lumps of soft clay, which at this point I can jam into the plate as hard as possible, as there's really nothing but solid clay in these, but that will change. One thing you might notice is that I'm turning on a wooden bat, and I do that so that I can flip the plate upside down easily onto another bat, for instance, without actually having to lift the pot up with my hands. As I continue trimming the piece and it gets thinner, the more it's manhandled, the greater the chance that I might accidentally bend it, and even if I were to correct it, that bend could come back to haunt me as the pot continues to dry out to leather hard. Once the top shape has been trimmed, I burnish over that area with a very smooth rubber kidney, just to make it as flat and flawless as it can be. I then lift the pot up and place it back down, but with a tiny bit of folded foam underneath it. This will prevent the top form from distorting and potentially sagging inwards as I trim the foot, as the central expanse of the plate gets thinner and thinner. I tap centre the plate, and at this point I'm watching the rim of the pot as opposed to the foot, to know when it's truly centred. Then I use a pair of set calipers and a potter's needle to mark the outermost boundary of the foot. This way all the plates are the same. A spinner is thrown on top, through which I can push down firmly to keep the plate in place, and then I can trim away at the sides to create the overhanging rim these pots will have. And here you can clearly see the mouldy clay as the stoneware is shaved off in these long ribbons. The annoying thing is, I actually really like how the 2 tones of clay work together, but there's no way, I think, that any remnants of the mouldy clay will remain, especially after the first electric firing to 1000 degrees Celsius. Once the overhang is complete, I burnish the outer edge, then remove the spinner so I have access to turn the centre. Also at this point, I can pin the plate down with 3 pieces of clay. I begin by making sure the base is perfectly flat, holding the tool firmly and bracing it against my left hand as I work. I then switch back to my sharper tungsten carbide trimming tool to begin hollowing out the footwell, and again revealing more of that mouldy clay, which does still smell relatively bad, but you can see how it's receded away from the outside of the pot as it's dried, Personally, I don't have any health issues using clay like this. It's said that mouldy clay can be better to work with as it changes the pH of the body and supposedly makes it more plastic, so it should be easier to throw with, but I don't think I have enough real exposure to that to know for sure. Also, it's worth mentioning that if you do have allergies to mould, you probably shouldn't be working with clay like this. And even though I think I'm fine, when I finished throwing with this stuff and trimming it, I washed my hands really thoroughly. The final step is to burnish over any sharp points, and then, like always, the piece is stamped with my maker's mark. I turn it out onto my hand, remove the foam, and just quickly check the rim. I just have to make sure it's crisp and even all the way around, as any defects on such a finely finished part of the pot will be really obvious. I also burnish the side of the plate, just to remove any remnants of clay from those lumps that were used to hold it down. Then I can continue trimming the rest. With all the plates now trimmed, I place them on a very flat surface to dry out. If I place these on an uneven surface, then there's a chance that as the plate dries, it conforms to the shape underneath it, which can result in plates that spin or tip to one side slightly, but a trimmed, tall enough foot ring should prevent things like this from happening. I kept all the mouldy clay aside, including all the throwing scraps, which are in the bottom of this bucket. I then sprayed it liberally with bleach and gave it a good mix. You can immediately see the difference in colour as the bleach is poured onto it. And I'll let all of this sit for a couple of days so that it can slake down into a fine slurry and then heaved out onto plaster bats to be recycled. Once these are bone dry, they're packed into my electric kiln for a bisque firing to 1000 degrees Celsius. Here they're piled up beneath some of the other shapes. I tend to stack them about 5 or 6 high and then place a few other light pots on top of them. And so far I've had no issues with these warping as they're fired. This first firing changes the clay into ceramic, which makes the pots much stronger and porous too, which means if dipped in water, they'd absorb it like a sponge. Previously, if I picked up any of these vessels just by the rim with one hand, it would immediately break off and shatter the pot, whereas now I can be a lot less careful when handling these, although they still are fragile, and if I were to knock the rim firmly, it could quite easily chip it. Before these pots can be glazed, they first have to be waxed. This basically acts like a wax resist, and wherever the wax is coated, the glaze won't be able to adhere to, which is vital, as the bases of these pots can't be glazed. Otherwise they'd stick and fuse to the kiln shelves during the firing, ruining the whole lot of them. In the past I've used molten beeswax to do this job, even paraffin wax, but with both you need to keep them molten over a small flame as you work, whereas this stuff is just the standard wax emulsion from Scarva pottery suppliers. It's no different really, but at least it can be watered down slightly to make it last longer, and brush on more smoothly, but you should never add water to molten beeswax or paraffin wax. Wax fires are explosive and dangerous. I've seen one, and ever since I've stuck to the emulsion, but I really miss the smell of molten beeswax filling the studio. This last dab of wax is just to make sure my maker's mark is completely sealed, as I've spent too much time in the past digging excess glaze out of it. And just how these are very easy shapes to throw, the glazing itself is just as straightforward. They're dipped in, swirled around a bit, and then held steady. They're then removed, and I try to catch some excess glaze on the top surface, which I swirl around, to create a thick layer on the top surface, so that the glaze melts and pools into the purposefully trimmed concave surface. In terms of how I hold the plate with the tongs, I try to grip it from one side. This way they can be placed onto a wearboard overhanging slightly. This means I can place them down when they're still quite wet, and I don't have to hold onto each pot, waiting until it's dry before I place it down. The final movement is a quick wobble like this, This causes the glaze to settle in a flat layer, and you may also see me occasionally blow on the piece, which I do to pop any bubbles that rise to the surface, as typically, if they're popped whilst the glaze is still wet, they seal back over, which means there's just one tiny bit less to tidy up at this stage. This is now a couple of days later, and this plate is covered in the same glaze you saw 2 moments earlier, only now it's completely dried out and lightened in colour. The glaze itself has also become very powdery and soft, and so to tidy up the shape and to remove the tongue marks, I can just gently rub my fingers over the surface, which creates glaze dust which fills any of the tiny holes in the surface. The tongue marks are also rubbed over, and basically my aim at this point is to create a surface that's as flush and even as possible, as the neater it is at this point, the better the pot will look once fired. The exact same thing is done on the underside, and I rest the pot on a pad of foam. This way the glaze on the delicate rim doesn't chip, and even though the base of the pot was covered in wax, there's always some glaze that settles onto it in tiny droplets, so those of course need to be dealt with. You can see those droplets more clearly here, and these alone may be enough to stick the pot to the shelf, so they must be dealt with. Beyond that, I use a wet sponge to fettle around the edge where the glaze meets the clay, and it's here that I want to make a very neat line, as how this melts sort of determines how professional the pot looks. As my pieces are quite uniform and strict, if the base of this pot was left with messy glaze, it would sort of go against everything I've been trying to achieve, so I try my hardest to make the undersides as neat as they can be. It's a lot of work, and it's often very monotonous and repetitive, but it's worth it. I should also note that all the excess glaze dust that's removed is eventually tipped into the basin you see to the right. I have one of these for each of the glazes I use, and eventually these basins of glaze are sieved back into the larger buckets, which means that very little glaze actually gets wasted, unless of course a pot actually fires badly and has to be smashed. And with the plates all cleaned up, they can be placed into the kiln. This is a 12 cubic foot gas kiln, and it being gas means that it can be fired in a reduction atmosphere, which is when, at a certain point during the firing, you throttle how quickly the exhaust can escape, which results in a lot of fuel being kept inside this chamber with an insufficient amount of oxygen present for it to burn efficiently. And therefore, as the flames themselves are seeking oxygen, they end up finding it in the pots and glazes themselves. And as these oxygen molecules are stripped away and the iron changes, it creates colour, surface, and even texture that can be relatively difficult to reproduce or borderline impossible to replicate properly with an electric kiln. This process is entirely manual, and the firing itself takes about 8.5 hours. The gas and air pressure and the damper position are all changed by hand, and all of these need to be worked harmoniously for the temperature to rise properly whilst maintaining a strong reduction. And one sure sign that a reduction is taking place is that you'll be able to see flames popping out of the spy holes and jettisoning out of the flues in the back. Once the pyrometric cones inside have bent over to my liking, the kiln can be switched off, the firing now finished. "36 hours later, and the kiln can be unpacked. I start by opening the dampers and the spy holes to let the last of the hot air out. I also position some wearboards to place the new pots onto, and once the temperature has dropped enough, the door can be cracked open. And finally, I get to see the finished plates, which, as they were so thick and close to the shelf, they really held on to the heat, so they were the last things I unpacked. And so far they're lovely things. The glaze has worked just how I want. It's pooled thickly and has created a really intense, crackled surface. I was somewhat worried that the thick glaze on the underside might run off and stick the pots to the shelf, but every single plate fired unscathed. The last step is to quickly sand the base of each. As clay is fired, it shrinks, and with this body, as it contains some grog, it recedes around the specks of sand, which, even though I burnish the bottoms to be very smooth, still make themselves present. So each plate is given a quick go-over with a diamond sanding pad, just enough to take the edge off the clay, as I wouldn't want the stoneware scratching any surface or tabletop it's placed on. With my work, I quite like there being a contrast underneath. You can feel and see the smooth glaze and the clay body the piece was made with, which is something I'm always intrigued about as a potter. I don't want to feel as if the clay body is an element I need to hide with my finished pieces. And I really like the toasted regions you can see on the foot, as a faint echo of the firing process they went through. And here's how I use my plates like this, for a quick afternoon treat, after a full day of taking photographs for an upcoming exhibition. Truth be told, I don't often use my own plates to eat from. Generally, I prefer using pots made by others, and the comparison I like to make is, imagine if you were a musician, and whenever you listen to music at home, you listen to your own stuff, which I just find a bit strange. This mug, for instance, was made by Bandana Pottery, and was given to me last year by a collector of mine, and the simple fact that it's so different from the type of pots I normally make is what makes it such a joy to use. Plus, their work can be quite difficult to obtain here in the UK. And so here are the finished plates in 3 colours. No 2 pieces are exactly alike. Some have slightly different shades of colour covering them. The feet are toasted with varying degrees of colour, and blots of iron pierce the surface in different ways, emerging as either tiny flecks of black or blossoming in larger metallic pools. A selection of these will be available at Yorkshire Sculpture Park to see in person and available to buy online too. And thankfully, at this point, there's absolutely no mould left in them. Thank you so much for taking your time to watch. It means so much, and by doing so, you help keep my small studio going, as these films help pay for the rent and cover the bills too, which is still something I never expected them to do. So thank you for sticking around, and I'll see you next Saturday for a change, for a very exciting, slightly different upload.